Hi, seventh graders, and happy Monday. Sorry for being MIA. I don't know if any of the other teachers told you what's been going on. Last weekend when I was up seeing Troy, we actually found out that he developed a blood infection. He had a bladder infection that just got really bad. So he had E. coli in his blood. He's being treated for it, and he's doing pretty well. But as a result, I end up spending every day with him at the hospital last week. And then, as you know, I planned on going back on leave anyway after last week. So unfortunately, I ended up having to leave a week sooner than anticipated, which means today we have a lot of ground to cover because I'm basically trying to cram 3 or 4 lectures into about 45 minutes here. So you should have your notes filled out from all the different days last week, and I'm just going to kind of haul butt through everything. So please keep up, correct things if you need to. But here we go. So we are starting with our preparing for war notes. So right from the beginning, something to always keep into the back of your mind is who won the election of 1860. If you recall from our part 1 test with tissues, this election was one of the many causes of war. And so we know Abraham Lincoln was elected. He'll be sworn in as president on March 4th, 1861. And something you should keep in the back of your mind, he did not initially take office to destroy slavery. His abolitionist beliefs instead evolved over time. With the election of Lincoln, we know that the South ends up believing that the national government is too strong. They don't like what's happening. We see that sectionalism belief come about, and they end up seceding. We have states leave the Union. Now, once the states leave the Union, we have an event that is eventually going to trigger the Civil War, and this event is Fort Sumter. So this will be right on the top of your preparing for war notes. Here's Fort Sumter today. It's kind of cool. You can still see like the original walls, but notice how, again, it's something of a lookout point. This is from the Pioneer Press in 1861. This is the actual newspaper article. The Pioneer Press was a prominent newspaper down in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. The Union. So the strengths of the Union, again, we're looking at the notes there, that particular box. You should have written down that the Union has a larger population. They have the better transportation network and a stronger economy. The weaknesses of the Union, they're fighting in enemy territory, and they're being forced to travel long distances. The South, on the other hand, their strength would be their good generals. They have plenty of food for armies because they are growing it themselves, and they have home field advantage. Weaknesses for the Confederacy would be the bad economy and the smaller population. It's estimated that they had about 5.5 million people to draw an army off of. Furthermore, they have the smaller transportation network. War plans of the North. Their plan is to block southern ports to destroy the economy. Again, something we looked at with the American Revolution. If you have control of the ports, you kind of control essentially what the outcome of war will be. Everything, right, all of the money, the economy flows in and out of those ports. So the North knows if they go off and block the southern ports that the South has no choice but to essentially lose, because the North won't trade anything with them. So if we cut off their outside resources, it's just a slow strangulation. They want to control the Mississippi River in order to divide the South. The South's war plans. They want to fight until the North is wore down, and then they want to capture Washington, D.C. And their other plan is to win foreign allies through trade. Again, when looking at the battles of, and now I lost it. When looking at the battles of the Civil War, where are they? Here we go. The first one that we start with is Fort Sumter. The Fort Sumter was a federal outpost in Charleston, South Carolina. That will be your location. Confederate forces asked for its surrender, and Lincoln refused. Jefferson Davis is the Confederate president at this time. He decides to attack before supply ships would make its way to the fort. So again, Davis decides to attack before um, reinforcements are able to arrive. Confederate cannons began firing on April 12th, 1861, so that's your date. And Fort Sumter fell 34 hours later to the Confederacy. So again, if we're looking at our notes, you have the date, the location was given, the winner would have been the South or the Confederacy. And looking at why this is important, will be in just a moment. So this is a famous painting of Fort Sumter. Kind of a little fun fact, the first shot of the American Civil War didn't actually hit anything. Instead, we have this large 10-inch mortar shell that will explode above the fort as a signal for the Confederate artillery to open fire on the Union fort. So now again, why is this important? This marks the beginning of the Civil War. Here's an actual photograph of Fort Sumter. Now that a war is officially underway, you have both Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis picking out their generals. So the first is, or one of the Lincoln's generals will be Mr. Winfield Scott. We have Irwin McDowell. George McClellan, this man will reappear later on in history. Ambrose Burnside. And if I'm not mistaken, there's a meme of him on my door that you should check out the next time you enter social studies. Joseph Hooker, George Meade, McClellan again, and the most well-known one, and another future president, Ulysses S. Grant. The generals of the Confederacy, we have Stonewall Jackson, George Pickett, James Longstreet, Nathan Bedford Forrest, Jeb Stuart, and Robert E. Lee. Notice that they all have pretty cool facial hair. All right, men present for war. Blue signifies the Union, green is the South. Notice our numbers in terms of thousands. The Union outnumbers the South, usually 2, if not 3 to 1, every single year of war. So Lincoln ordered General McDowell to lead his 17,000-man army to the Confederate capital of Richmond. We're looking at the First Battle of Bull Run. McDowell's army was headed to Manassas, Virginia, which will be an important railroad junction. We have about 18,000 Confederate troops under the command of General Beauregard, who were waiting for McDowell and his troops along the creek called Bull Run. So again, we have about 17,000 going up against 18,000. On the morning of July 12, 1861, the Union manages to cross the creek, and they will drive back the left side of the Confederate line. So again, here's a date. And if you were looking for location, you have Manassas, Virginia, or you could say Bull Run Creek as well. That's fine. One unit will hold firm. This will be Stonewall Jackson's unit. This is where he gets his infamous nickname, the Stonewall. Because of this general, the Confederates will push the Union forces back towards Bull Run Creek, forcing them to retreat. So again, we have the Battle of Bull Run here. Notice you have the red or the pink, however you see it, being the Confederate forces. You have Union coming in. The Union forces came from Washington, D.C. Because they lose, they're being forced to retreat. Here's your stats. Killed. The Union loses 460 men. Over 1,100 are wounded and 1,300 are captured. So total losses are nearly 2,900 men. The South, on the other hand, has almost 2,000. They end up having a lot of gentlemen who are wounded, but then notice how many men they have captured. we were only able to take 13 of the Confederate soldiers captive. They took 1,300 of our men. So why is Bull Run Creek important? It's essentially the first battle of war, and it gives the Confederacy hope and inspires revenge in the Union. Also, if you look back at the map, something else to consider is that we're forced to retreat back to our capital. Again, leaders of the Confederacy, I've thrown these names out. We have Jefferson Davis there on the left, and then Alexander Stephens is the vice president on the right. Here's your Confederate White House, located in Richmond, and the Confederate seal. Their motto is, "With God as our vindicator." Of course, this is all in Latin. Something I want you to focus on within that seal. Notice who is riding a horse. You have George Washington, but the big thing is to look at what's included here. You have cotton, you have rice, tobacco, you get sprigs of indigo. So again, all the major cash crops that are important to the South appear there within their Confederate seal. So thus far, looking at your list, you have to figure out who's winning. As you know, it's the South. Now, while we have two armies fighting for control of land, there's actually the Union Navy that's controlling the sea. So the North had the industry and men to build the ironclads, the ships heavily armored with iron. So the Confederacy is going to turn to Great Britain for new ships because obviously the North isn't going to supply them with anything. The Union blockaded the South, reducing the number of ships entering the southern port from 6,000 to 800 a year. So again, when you have control of the sea or when you have control of the ports, you control what happens to the economy because it's a direct impact. So obviously, the North is trying to just strangulate the South as best they can. This is known as the Anaconda Plan, which I'll talk more about here. Again, you have the naval blockade going on, and then you have our northern troops wanting to go into Richmond, and then we want that strangulation here coming south down the Mississippi and then heading up even from New Orleans and going north. And so it's actually seen as, there will be a picture I'll show you later. It actually shows like a snake, like an anaconda, choking off the South. We'll see various battles of the ironclads. I'm going to just kind of skip through this because I only have so much time. So here we see actually two ironclads duking it out. Notice early Civil War submarine. So while we have ironclads duking it out, back on land, the Union has captured Fort Henry and Donelson in February of 1862. So again, to kind of give you that timeline, Lincoln is elected in 1860, and then we will see the Union start to capture various forts within 2 years. Those victories are going to open the door for General Grant to head south into Tennessee. Sizing up the competition for our next battle, with the Union, we have Grant marching in with 30,000 men. He is marching south. Buell has 50,000 men marching west to join Grant's army. The South, Johnston had 45,000 troops, and he believed his best chance of recapturing the Tennessee was by launching a surprise attack against Grant as soon as he could. And this will lead us to the Battle of Shiloh. Again, notice your blue arrows and where they're meeting, and then you have Johnston coming up from the south. So in the early morning of April 6, 1862, the Confederacy will launch their surprise attack on Grant's men. The battle lasted 2 days and Johnston was killed. The arrival of Buell's men helped the Union regain strength and then push the enemy back into Mississippi. We'll see approximately 24,000 men die. Of those, 13,000 were Union soldiers. So again, you have a date. Shiloh, if you didn't pick up from the map, is in Tennessee for your location. And why is it important? It allowed the Union to gain control of the Mississippi River Valley. So if you're trying to figure out who the winner is, it's obviously the Union or the North. All right, so if we look here, we are gaining control of Mississippi River Valley. here in the north. Okay, that's what we just completed. On April 25th, 1862, a Union fleet captured New Orleans. The Union was on its way to achieving the goal of splitting the Confederacy in two. So again, we've come down here. We've got control of the Mississippi River. We've captured New Orleans now. After the fall of New Orleans, McClellan will start advancing towards the capital of Richmond, Virginia. In the meantime, Robert E. Lee will take control of Confederate troops. He actually sent a spy to locate McClellan's position and attack the Union Army from June to July of 1862. So, if you're, again, trying to get some dates, we have June to July of 1862, and here is why it is important. The two sides fought for a week, hence the name the 7 Days Battle. Although the Confederacy suffered heavier losses, the Union was actually forced to retreat from the Confederate capital of Richmond. We had to leave. And so the South regains control of their capital. So looking at that, you'd be able to identify that the Confederacy won. Prison camps. I'm going to touch on this just real briefly. If you recall from the First Battle of Bull Run, we have men being taken captive quite often. And so this kind of gives you the map or location of the prison camps. 15 of them is what we have. Here are your camps or the Union prison camps, and then the Confederate prison camps. We have just a few examples of them. Elmira Prison, this is in New York. It'll house 12,000 Confederate soldiers, even though it only had room for 5,000. And then these are actual photographs. For those of you who know history, the only thing that you often can relate it to would be like concentration camps. And unfortunately, we'll see something like this actually reappear in the United States with World War II and the relocation of Japanese Americans as well. Camp Douglas is another one. This actually served as a training facility before it was conformed to a prison camp. It housed 18,000 soldiers. Over 4,200 men will die there, and was also known as the 80 Acres of Hell. Here's a drawing of it. Again, notice you have the buildings, the trees. It almost kind of looks like a tiny little town in a way, even though it's a prison camp. Some of the gentlemen who are being held captive. Andersonville. This was known as America's Auschwitz. This camp only existed for 14 months, but will house 45,000 Union troops. From that number, we'll see 13,000 men die. So the commander of the camp, Captain Henry Wirz, was one of the few men that were actually executed for his Civil War crimes. Again, notice just kind of how it's set up. Notice the two walls. You have the lookout posts, that tent housing, or those few barracks. Pretty desolate, nothing around. So prison camps during the Civil War were potentially more dangerous and more terrifying than the battles themselves. A soldier who survived his ordeal in camp often bore those deep psychological scars. We're going to see 56,000 men die in prison camps over the course of the war, and this will account for roughly 10% of the war's total death toll, and will exceed the American combat losses in World War I, Korea, and Vietnam. So again, prison camps during the Civil War is not something that's often talked about in American history, but definitely something that you should look into a little bit more. So war continues. Following the 7 Days Battle, Lincoln became frustrated and ordered General John Pope to march directly to Richmond from Washington, D.C. Jackson wanted to defeat Pope's men before they joined up with McClellan's larger army, and so we have another showdown at Bull Run. So again, notice the Union here, and then obviously the Confederacy. So the Second Battle of Bull Run. Jackson and Pope's men met on the battlefield in August of 1862. They will fight for 3 days outside of Manassas, Virginia. So again, date, location. On the third day of battle, the Confederates forced the Union to retreat. So again, if the Union is retreating, that means the South won. So why is this important? This is actually going to inspire Lee to take war to the north, is what we'll do. At this point now, the South has kind of had the home field advantage, and they're willing to basically start fighting more outside of their territory. And so I guess something you have to ask yourself or maybe think about is, how is this going to impact their success in the war? So invading in the north, riding the waves of success after the 7 Days Battle and the Second Battle of Bull Run, General Lee is going to invade the north. He will write a letter to President Jefferson Davis about his plan, but he didn't wait for a response back. His reasons for invading: victory in the north might force peace talks. He thinks that if he is successful, the north might just decide to throw their hands up and just be done with war. He thinks that the invasion would give Virginia farmers a rest from the war during harvest season. Again, many of the battles have been fought on farmland. So not only do they need to get the harvesting done, but they're also losing quite a bit of money in crops. Confederates could steal from the North. The South is obviously lacking resources, and he hoped it would show that the Confederacy could win the war, and then it would allow European nations to side with the South. Antietam. Lee is going to lead 40,000 men into Maryland in September of 1862. He'll split his army into two and send half to Harper's Ferry with Stonewall Jackson. When he arrives in Maryland, he issues a warning trying to get the people of Maryland to join the Confederacy. So I always kind of saw this as Lee kind of just like riding down the streets, hollering out about how awesome he is and why they just need to join him in the South and, you know, all the greatness that is the Confederacy. Maybe it's funnier in my head than how I'm describing it, but that's what happens when you're a history nerd. Battle of Antietam. The two armies are going to meet along the creek there in Maryland. The battle is going to last for hours, and by the end of the day, the Union Army is going to suffer more than 12,000 casualties. The Confederates will endure about 13,000. In the end, Lee will be pinned down at Antietam Creek by George McClellan, and the Union forces Lee back to the South. So why is this so important? We actually kind of have a variety of reasons. First, it's going to force Lee back to the South. It ends up being the bloodiest day. And then this victory is what Lincoln needed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. So if you know anything about history and what I've talked about so far this year, the Emancipation Proclamation will be the freeing of the slaves. Something to consider: was it a good idea for General Robert E. Lee to invade the North? Why or why not? And I usually hear a variety of responses like, well, it was worth a shot. And others will say, no, it did them more harm than good, things to that nature. Upset by Lee's failed attempt to capture the North, the Union wanted to take firm control of the Mississippi and cut off the Confederacy's trade with Europe. But first, Lincoln will issue the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. I'm just going to skip through this because I don't have time. Following the Emancipation Proclamation, many freed African Americans will join the Union Army. A lot of white Northerners aren't ready for this. They needed to still try to figure out how to accept their new comrades. Now, something to remember: just because the North or many people in the North were abolitionists, it doesn't mean that they're ready to have Africans living among them freely. Like, there's still very much so a racial divide. And I don't want to say that there are racists in the North, because that would only be partly true. But there's still this fear and this unknown, because you have to remember, they're still different. At least that's how the European settlers or the white Europeans are seeing them. We're going to see roughly 180,000 African American men serve in the Union Army. They receive $10 a month, while their white counterparts received $13. So again, right from the beginning, there's that discrimination piece, even in their salary. So when you look at issues that we have today within race itself, again, despite being free, they're already discriminated against. And that started right away. Vicksburg. The Mississippi River is the single most important economic feature of North America. Everything that the South was at this time was basically because of the Mississippi River and the Port of New Orleans. So Vicksburg, Mississippi will be the location. It's actually perched along a 200-foot cliff, so the city can't be taken by storm like normal battle. Instead, it has to be kind of gone about in a different direction. Grant and his men would have to surround the city, and the army will establish a line of works and cut off Vicksburg from supply and communication from the outside world. This battle will last from May to July of 1863. Grant and his men will eventually gain control of the city, forcing the South to surrender, and as a result, the Union will gain the last stretch of the Mississippi River. So why this is important? The Union wins first and foremost, but it'll officially split the South into two parts, and it cut off trade with Europe. So we see, again, the cliffs up here. We have kind of that strangulation concept going on by the north with ironclads. All right. This was the last thing that you had taken notes on, the war ending. So while Vicksburg is underway, one of the most infamous battles of the Civil War is going on at the same time, and that is Gettysburg. So for the second time, Lee has decided to take war to the north. This time he strives a bit farther than just jumping a border. He actually makes his way into Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. So there's your location. The date will be July 1st through the 3rd of 1863, and the goal of the South is to defeat the Union Army once and for all. So Gettysburg, day one. Armies are still coming together. The Confederates outnumber the Union troops. The Union will actually retreat through the town of Gettysburg to the south side. General Lee wants his men to continue to attack and finish off the troops. However, his men delayed, and the Union had the opportunity to dig in and set up their defenses. By the second day, the armies from both sides were now at full force. The Union has 94,000 soldiers, and the Confederacy has roughly 72,000, which, I mean, you have a lot of men fighting, but you still have 22,000 more men fighting for the North than the South. Lee will attack, and there is going to be fierce fighting throughout the day, with both sides taking heavy losses. The Union lines will hold firm. By the third day, General Lee knows that he has to kind of make an all-or-nothing attack. He really felt if he could win this battle, that the South would win the war. So he will send General Pickett with 12,500 men on a direct charge to the heart of the Union Army. Pickett's men were defeated, with over half of them being injured or killed. General Lee and the Confederate Army will retreat. So the Union wins. Why this is important, it's kind of considered to be the turning point of the war. As a result, we will see President Lincoln issue the Gettysburg Address on November 1st, 1863. All right. So following the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln knew he needed a victory for the Union Army to help basically win him the re-election, because as sad as it is, you're only a good president if you're winning a war, or so the American people think. So he will actually turn to General Sherman for this victory. So in the spring of 1864, Sherman will march south from Tennessee with 100,000 troops. His goal is to take Atlanta, Georgia, and knock out the important railroad link. So I think actually at this point, just to kind of stop and peek back, we have Gettysburg should be done. We're on war ends. So we've just gone over number one, who strikes in the South, and then what his goal would be. His goal is to take Atlanta, Georgia, and knock out the important railroad link. From May to August, his army moves through the Appalachian Mountains towards Atlanta. The Confederate General John Hood commanded the Confederate forces and would repeatedly attack Sherman's men. However, he proved to have the stronger army, and Atlanta fell to the Union on September 2nd, 1864. Most of the city will be destroyed by artillery and fire. Sherman will continue marching through Georgia, destroying everything in his path, hoping to bring war to a dramatic end. So that idea of kind of total war that we talked about at the beginning of the unit is what we see come about here. So if we look, he'll take Atlanta, and then Sherman will just kind of keep moving through all these major towns. Again, just destroying absolutely everything in his path. In the 1864 election, President Lincoln will run against George McClellan. If you recall, he used to be one of Lincoln's generals. Lincoln actually fired him, more or less, let him go. He wasn't a very good general. He didn't possess kind of that common sense or the leadership skills needed to bring success to the North. So the outcome of war. Sherman's march to the sea inflicted total war in the South. Shortly after this campaign ended, on April 9th, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered his army to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, or in the village of Appomattox Courthouse, because that's actually the name of the town. It's not actually a building, per se. The papers of formal surrender were signed in the home of Wilmer McLean, and his house was actually damaged during the first battle of the Civil War. So here we have that official surrender, April 9th, 1865. Again, this comes from the Pioneer Press. Notice all of the different headlines. General Lee and his whole army surrendered, the rebellion dead. Despite just receiving this news, we also find out that President Lincoln is killed by an assassin. He's shot through the head. The assassin leaps upon the stage and escapes in the rear of the theater. So again, in Minnesota, because we don't have modern technology, we find out about the end of the war at the same time we're figuring out that the president has been assassinated. So just to review the Civil War casualties, we'll lose roughly 620,000 men. And as you know, a good chunk of that's actually to the disease and stuff that you read about last week. World War II, we have 318,000 men die, and then we kind of see the numbers dwindle from there. Here are your casualties on both sides. Notice the number of men who die from disease. We have nearly 250,000 men from the North alone die. Your death rate. If you were to join the army, these are your odds of dying. If you were fighting for the North, it was 24 or 23%, and the South was roughly 24. So Lincoln's assassination will happen at Ford's Theater. The assassin is Mr. John Wilkes Booth, and this is something we'll go into more detail about in February. I actually have a little project for you on Thursday this week. Notice the reward. He did not act alone. There was actually a variety of conspirators involved in all this. Lincoln will die early the next morning of April 15th. So he's shot the night of the 14th, dies in the early hours of the 15th because the bullet wound didn't kill him right away. And this is the public execution of some of the conspirators. This is actually the first woman to be executed here, Mary Surratt, by the federal government. So some of the questions on your notes. Did the war succeed with their war plan? How? Yes, they succeeded because of the Anaconda Plan. Shiloh allowed them to gain control of the Mississippi River Valley, and Vicksburg will split the South in two. The economy of the South following the Civil War, it's totally destroyed. The Anaconda Plan cut imports and exports down to a minimum, and Sherman's march was entirely destructive. Politics. Lincoln was reelected. If McClellan would have won, things may have gone differently. I don't want to say that the South could have won the war, but I think it's a possibility still. So the effects of war, this is your syringe notes. The first one is slavery. Slavery was ended. This officially was outlawed with the 13th Amendment. Industrialism is your I. We'll see new technologies begin to develop due to the demand for Reconstruction. Reconstruction was the plan to rebuild America. This will kind of be the theme of your next unit that we'll look at in January. Nation. The United States will become one again. Southern states actually had to reapply for admission. And what the North did was basically dictate whether or not they would be accepted. Um, Basically, this is the North's way of kind of being like the puppeteer, right? Like, you need to stop doing this, this, and this if you want to be part of the United States again. It was their way of getting what they wanted from the South. Jim Crow laws is the last thing you're writing down. These are the state and local laws that enforced racial segregation in the southern United States. And this is going to, Jim Crow laws will be around for quite some time. We'll see issues with this even into the 1950s and 60s. And some of you might even argue that racial segregation, to some extent, still exists socially today. All right. So a lot just happened today. Again, we just went over basically all of the lectures with no class discussion, which is kind of sad for me because I always like the discussions we have with the Civil War. All right, looking at your test for Wednesday. You'll have a review tomorrow and a test Wednesday. Your test on Wednesday is 1 page, front to back, nothing super fancy. Your battles of the war will be multiple choice here. You have to basically match up the importance with each one. So again, you don't need to know the date. I do ask you to identify, though, who won each particular battle. So you'll write an N for North and S for South. Each is used 4 times. So that should be fairly easy for you. It's always even. So again, you'll need to know who won the battles and why they are important. The effects of war. I have a variety of questions for you. Where Lee surrenders to Grant, when the war officially ends, who inflicted total war in the South, the 2 battles that allowed the North to succeed with their war plan, and what the economy of the South was like following the war. Then, lastly, I have you fill in syringe. So this is you basically regurgitating that information from your notes. For tissues, I used to make you write that in, but I actually redid that for unit or for part 1. I'm going to actually have you fill this in. I'm not going to rewrite it until multiple choice questions. So if there's anything that you're going to want to study, for sure it'll be this piece. Again, your test is on Wednesday. There will be a review tomorrow, but this is your time to start looking at it all right now. So you won't hear from me tomorrow. I planned on maybe taping a lecture then. Unless this lecture ran over, you'll listen to it tomorrow. But this is what your test is going to look like. So again, you have matching for battles and why they're important. You have to identify who wins the battles, and then a few multiple choice questions, and then filling in syringe. So I wish you the best of luck on your test, and I hope that you have a great week and a wonderful Christmas break, and you will hear my voice again after break. So you guys take care, and I miss you lots. Bye.